Welcome back to our 6-part series on the Second Vatican Council from a salvation historical view. In the last lesson, we gave you a background to what the Second Vatican Council is, discussing its historical context, what its aims are, and what sort of documents it issued. Today, we're actually going to start going into the teachings of the Council itself through its documents. Now, remember, we're going to be following a salvation historical thematic approach to the Council rather than just going through the documents one at a time. So in each episode, we'll draw from different documents, not just one. Today's topic that lays the groundwork is our common humanity, that is, what humanity has in common. So before we get into specifics about what makes Catholicism unique, we're going to discuss what all people, whether they're Catholic or not Catholic, whether they're Christian or not, all have in common. And this theme actually is expressed by the Council quite explicitly and beautifully. In Nostra Aetate, the Council taught, one is the community of all peoples, one their origin, for God made the whole human race to live over the face of the earth. One also is their final end. Now, so what the Council is saying here is that humanity has one origin and one end. What do we mean by that? According to our Catholic faith, God is the creator of all things. And so he is the one from whom all things come. So we have God is the source of all existence. This is creation. But God, as the creator, created with a purpose. He had a reason for creating us and for creating humanity. And the goal of creation was actually to offer creation communion with himself, to allow creation to be united with him. And so all things don't just proceed forth from God, but are ordered to return back to God. And so he is also the final end or goal, as the Greeks would say, the telos of all things. And so this, for now, we're going to term salvation. And so these are actually two sides of the same coin. You have the proceeding forth from God and then the returning back to God. This is what the scholastics would call the exitus, the proceeding forth, versus the reditus, which is the return. And so those two things go together. The way that you understand the thing is the reason for which it was created. And therefore, we understand humanity from the vantage point of where it came from and what it is meant for, what it is destined for. So God is both the origin and the goal of human existence, of human nature. And as Genesis tells us, and as Gaudium et Spes relates as well, man was created in the image of God and is thus capable of knowing and loving his Creator. That's from Gaudium et Spes, number 12. And so what do we mean by that when we say that man is created in the image of God? Primarily what we mean is that man reflects God in two ways. Through our spiritual nature, the fact that we are embodied spirits, we have a mind and a will. That is, we can know things, we can choose things, and love things. So, it is through our intellect and our will that we reflect God in a way that is different from all of the rest of creation. Because in order for creation to be brought into union with God, in a union of love, that love has to be freely given. And so in order for that to take place, there has to be a creature that's capable of knowing and loving God. And so that's where our human nature comes from. That's why our human nature exists, to come to know and love God. Now, there's another aspect of humanity that is also revealed through the Christian tradition. You see, the philosophers of old were able to conclude that God was one, that he was supreme, self-subsisting esse or being itself. But through Revelation, we've been given another very important understanding about God, which is that God is actually triune. So while there's only one God, there are still three persons, three divine persons that stand in mutual relation to one another. And so you have God himself, the source of all things and the goal towards which all things tend, is in himself a communion of persons. He's relational, which is very different than what you would see in a purely Platonic or Aristotelian notion of God, because they didn't have the understanding that God was relational. As a matter of fact, Aristotle thought relation was one of the lowest kinds or accidents to existence. But what we know now is that God himself, being communal, being interpersonal, means that all things have this relational element to them. And that's not a knock against the goodness, but is actually part of the goodness of things. And that includes the human person, that we are called to be communal as well. We are made in the image and likeness of God, who is a communion of three persons. We too are called to be in communion with himself and with others. So, and as I was saying before, in order for the communion to really exist and be authentic, it has to be freely given. It can't just be dictated. We can't just, if we just, you can't really force love. It has to be freely given, otherwise it's not really love, right? And so God had to give us the capacity also to reject him. And that, of course, would lead to separation from God. And that's what happened through the sin of our first parents. Now, what this means is that the original communion, that was the reason for humanity being created, has been disrupted through our own choice to separate from God. And thus, you have the result of the misuse of our free will, which you can also call sin. Sin ends up leading to disunity or a lack of communion and integrity on three levels. So, first, as we already noted, it leads to a separation from God, a lack of communion with him. But it also divides us from one another, right? A lot of sins are acts of injustice where we mistreat other people or use them for our own purposes. And so there's also division created between one person and another, or between whole groups of people and other groups of people. So now there's also division within humanity. And that makes sense, right? I mean, when we do things that are wrong, other people are often hurt by it, and therefore our relationship with them is also hurt. And that's what we see in our world today. There's all sorts of divisions amongst people, right? Now, there's a third level that might not be as obvious to people at first, but it's also extremely important, and that's actually the integrity of the individual human person. See, through sin, our own being as an individual is also disrupted and disintegrated. So you have a disintegration of the individual. What do we mean by that? There's that famous saying from St. Paul that I don't do the things that I know I should, and I do the things that I know I shouldn't. We very often are at odds with ourselves between what we know we should do and what we know is right versus what we want to do. And that conflict that we experience within us is a result of the fall. It is part of original sin and our concupiscence. It also is amplified and made more by our own personal sins, which lead us to be disordered in our desires and in our actions. And so sin also causes our division from our own selves, a lack of integrity within the individual human person. So the council talks about all three of these levels. So Sacrosanctum Concilium speaks of the first two levels of disunity when it speaks about sin as an offense against God, while also acknowledging the social consequences of sin. So that's levels 1 and 2. Gaudium et Spes notes both the second and third levels when it speaks about the social and individual consequences of sin, as well as their relationship to one another. It says, when the structure of affairs is flawed by the consequences of sin, man, already born with a bent toward evil, finds there new inducements to sin, which cannot be overcome without strenuous efforts and the assistance of grace. So in other words, even if when we're left on our own, we might struggle with sin already. But when we see injustice in the world or the society in which we live, in our community, or even within our own family, those social flaws can actually tempt us to sin even more in reaction to them. And so it's sort of like this vicious cycle of the sins around us and then our own personal sins. All right. Now, Gaudium et Spes speaks about the disruption caused by sin several more times. I just want to go through a couple of quotes that highlights the different aspects of how sin damages us. It says, sin has diminished man, blocking his path to fulfillment. It also says, wounded by sin, man experiences rebellious stirrings in his body. And again, man's freedom has been damaged by sin. It also mentions the fact that our intellects have been hampered and weakened through sin, which leads us to uncertainty about the truth. Gaudium et Spes addresses our mortality as well as linked to sin, when it speaks of that bodily death from which man would have been immune had he not sinned. It also goes on to speak about our divine likeness, because man was created in the image and likeness of God. Now, traditionally, what we mean by that is man was created as the image of God according to man's human nature, as well as already given some grace at the moment of creation, which raises that nature up, brings it to a higher level, and so that's the divine likeness. But as Gaudium et Spes says, the divine likeness had been disfigured from the first sin onward. Now, I want to pause here for a second, because some of you may have heard that Vatican II avoided speaking about sin and pretended that everything was fine the way it is. We're all just doing great and dandy. But obviously that's not true. Time and again, the Second Vatican Council spoke about the reality of sin and the grave consequences that sin brings into ourselves, into our society, and also the danger it plays to our salvation. So, I just want to summarize real quick what we've covered thus far to get our bearings. God, the creator of all things, willed to offer a share in his own life to creation. God thus created a creature capable of knowing and loving him, which is what human nature is. That's what humanity is. But our choice to disobey God has had an ontological effect on us. What do we mean by that? Ontology or metaphysics is the knowledge about being, which very often speaks about the natures of things. Well, our nature is affected by the choices we make. So, using our intellect and will contrary to God damages our status as the image of God. Remember, we had said that man is the image of God primarily because we have a mind and a will, an intellect that can know and a will that can choose and to love. So when we misuse those faculties, we're damaging that image that we are. We're lacking the perfection of that image. And so our intellects and wills are distorted and weakened through sin. Man is thus separated from God and thus from eternal life, which is the whole goal of human existence. So when we separate ourselves from God through sin, we're now going in the opposite direction of the reason we were created. And again, man's social character is also affected. So humanity has become divided within itself through sin. There's no enmity between one person and another and between whole groups of people with other groups. And then there's also disorder within the individual human person themselves. Now, because there are these three levels of division that sin brings in, man needs to be redeemed on all three levels. And remember, this notion of division being brought in by sin is the opposite of what we said was the origin and end of man, which was communion. Because God is a communion, right? So the whole goal of creation and salvation is unity. So division is the opposite. It works in the opposite direction of that. And that's why it's so grave. So let's now consider our common humanity from the vantage point of humanity after the fall. We all have this common experience of concupiscence, meaning this tension between our body and soul, where our desires for the goods of the earth are often disordered. We want them disproportionately. We want to use them in ways they were not meant to be used. And so we're often tempted to continue to sin because of this fallen nature that we have inherited from our first parents. That's why Gaudium et Spes speaks about the slavery to sin. It's almost as if the sin and our attachment to it controls us. Because even if we want to be rid of that sin, it can be very difficult to overcome it and to be free of it. It's like a certain slavery that we're almost choosing and yet not wanting at the same time. Now, in our current state, in our fallen state, there's still this obligation. And Dignitatis Humanae talks about it when it says, all men are bound to seek the truth, especially in what concerns God and his church, and to embrace the truth they come to know and to hold fast to it. And it says that this obligation is twofold. It comes from our nature and thus also has a moral character to it as well. As it goes on, it is in accordance with their dignity as persons, that is, beings endowed with reason and free will, and therefore privileged to bear personal responsibility, that all men should be at once impelled by nature and also bound by a moral obligation to seek the truth, especially religious truth. They are also bound to adhere to the truth once it is known, and to order their whole lives in accordance with the demands of truth. Now, this might surprise you. We're talking about a document, Dignitatis Humanae, that is on religious liberty or religious freedom. And yet, from the very beginning, the document is talking about obligations to seek the truth, to adhere to the truth, as being part of our nature and a moral obligation. So it might be strange that in a document about freedom, there's so much emphasis on obligation, adherence, and responsibility. It seems to be counterintuitive to us. But that's because Catholicism has a very important view of freedom. And our freedom is tied back to our ontology, that is, our human nature itself. And you see, our intellects are ordered towards the truth. And so in order to have your intellect perfected, which means to have your nature perfected, since the intellect is a major part of your nature, you have to know the truth, because knowing the truth is the perfection of your mind. Similarly, the will is ordered towards the good. So the will is perfected when it desires and chooses the good. Insofar as we don't know the truth and are ignorant or reject the truth, or insofar as we don't really love the good or we don't pursue the good, then we are not perfected in our nature. We're actually distorted in our nature. And so those are acts that would be contrary to our nature and misuses of our capabilities. But then that has consequences for us that are very grave and intimately interior to the human person. You see, the moral life is not just about what we do, it's about what we become. There's a certain ontology to human freedom. Unlike other parts of creation who don't have an intellect or a will and just act on instinct or according to predetermined natural laws, we actually do bear responsibility. And so the choices we make determine whether or not we become more like what we were meant to be or we become less like what we were created to be. And I'm going to use an analogy here. Think about angels and demons. Now, they are both spiritual beings that do not have bodies. They are perfect, just spiritual beings. But they do have intellects and they have wills. What's the difference? Well, an angel, through its free will, has chosen to obey God and to pursue the good. A demon, in its rejection of obedience to God, has become distorted in its nature. And so you have these two different results. Angels are perfected in their nature and reflect that to the highest degree possible. And then demons are still spiritual creatures with intellects and wills, but they are the utter opposite of what they were meant to be. They reject the truth and they hate the good. And so that kind of gives a good analogy of what happens to us. Are we going to be perfected in our nature by seeking the truth and following it? Or are we going to allow ourselves to be disrupted and disordered and become the opposite of what we were meant to be? And so that's why this document is so insistent on the need to seek the truth and to adhere to it. Because without the truth and without following the truth, we can't fulfill our own nature as human beings. Now, it's important to realize we are also bound by the truth about our human nature and its ends. We didn't create ourselves. We didn't create our own nature. And so the truth about what is good for man, what is appropriate for man, comes from God the Creator, not from ourselves. And so we can't just create what it means to be human or what it is to perfect humanity. We must learn it and follow it. Which means that natural law and divine moral law are not arbitrary rules. They are aids to our freedom, not hindrances to our freedom, because they tell us the truth about what is good for us as human beings. And now there's another aspect to this. Virtue. What is virtue? It's a strength or a habit that corresponds to the true good for man. And as fallen creatures, we really need two things to become virtuous. One, we need grace that will heal our broken nature, as well as practice. It's sort of like lifting weights. When you first start lifting weights, you're going to be fairly weak, but over time, this will become easier and easier. You'll be able to add more weight to the bar as you get stronger. And it's similar with virtue. The more you act virtuously, the easier it is to continue to act virtuously. There's a great analogy for this that the Dominican scholar Servais Pincares has written, and it's an analogy about the piano. Now, I can't play the piano. I wish I could, but I can't. Let me read to you this analogy he gives. Of course, anyone is free to bang out notes haphazardly on the piano as the fancy strikes him. But this is a rudimentary, savage sort of freedom. It cloaks an incapacity to play even the simplest pieces accurately and well. On the other hand, the person who really possesses the art of playing the piano has acquired a new freedom. He can play whatever he chooses and also compose new pieces. His musical freedom could be described as the gradually acquired ability to execute works of his choice with perfection. It is based on natural dispositions and a talent developed and stabilized by means of regular, progressive exercises, or properly speaking, a habitus, a habit. That's why there's the obligation to seek truth and to adhere to it once it is known, especially the truth about God and religion and the moral life. Let me give you another example. Let's say that I wanted to buy a used car, and I came across an ad for a car that was priced at $10,000. Now, I don't know anything about how cars run. I really don't. Now, imagine there's a mechanic that's interested in the same vehicle and is able to inspect the vehicle to see its condition. Who is more free in making the decision about whether or not that car is worth the price that it's being offered for? I think everyone would agree that the mechanic is much more free to make the decision because he's more well-informed. I, on the other hand, have to trust the seller's statements that it's in good condition and whatnot, whereas the mechanic can actually investigate it and know what condition it is to know whether or not it's a fair price. So both of us can make a free choice whether or not to buy the car. But the more informed you are, the more free you are, because you're making an informed decision. So our intellects, the knowledge of truth, aids our will. It aids our ability to make good choices. And that's the same thing here when it comes to religion and the moral life as well. The more we know, the freer we are. And that's why learning the truth about God and religion and morality is actually an improvement of our freedom, not a hindrance to it. All right. Now, if there's an obligation to seek the truth and to adhere to it, there's also a correlative right to do so. So that obligation comes with a right, meaning because we bear personal responsibility, then we also have to be given the freedom to pursue the truth and to adhere to it insofar as we are known. And that's where the Council's teaching on religious freedom or religious liberty comes from. Now, the search for truth and the choice to adhere must be an authentically free human act. Therefore, Dignitatis Humanae says, "Wherefore, every man has the duty and therefore the right to seek the truth in matters religious in order that he may with prudence and form for himself right and true judgments of conscience under use of all suitable means." I want to note something important here. Note that Dignitatis Humanae is not basing this on a false notion of the equal validity, truthfulness, or goodness of all religions. It's not talking about a freedom based on arbitrary choice between two equally good options, as if you could just choose Pepsi or Coke and they're both equally good and therefore your choice doesn't matter. No, that's not what it's basing it on. The religious liberty it's talking about is based on our obligation to seek the truth and to adhere to it. And since it has to be a personal choice to seek the truth and adhere to it, that's why there's freedom. It's not freedom from pursuing the truth and following it, or determining what it is according to your own preferences. It's a freedom based on the obligation, and therefore the fact that it's a personal responsibility. Now also, it's important to keep in mind that the Council is talking about a very specific type of religious freedom. It says, "Religious freedom in turn, which men demand as necessary to fulfill their duty to worship God, has to do with immunity from coercion in civil society." So what it's saying is that religious freedom is freedom from coercion in a civil society, so that the state government does not have a right to force you into one religious practice or to prevent you from engaging in your own religious practices. It can't demand that you follow one specific religion or not. Why? Because religion transcends the authority of the civic realm. So that's what it's talking about. It's basically saying that a secular government has no right to coerce you to hold or practice one specific religion over another. Now, there was a relatio at the council. What is a relatio? Basically, a relatio is the members of the drafting committees of the documents giving an explanation to the bishops as to what is to be understood by certain phrases. So if there was some question of, well, does it mean this or does it mean that, the drafters would actually give an official relatio, it's relating to them, what they meant by a certain phrase, and therefore they could vote accordingly. So that relatio stated that if it coerced its citizens for religious reasons, then the public power's coercive action would intrude into the order of religion as such, which is unlawful, Unlawful here means morally evil or illicit. Now, there are due limits to this right to religious liberty or freedom, because the state does have the right to preserve the just public order, and therefore it can set limits if one claims to be doing something as a matter of religious freedom, but it involves injustice. So you can't just make the claim, well, I'm doing this because it's part of my religious practice and beliefs, if you're actually disrupting the just public order and you're committing injustices towards other people. So there are limits to it. All right. So, as an explanation of that, the document continues, society has the right to defend itself against possible abuses committed on the pretext of freedom of religion. It is the special duty of government to provide this protection. However, government is not to act in an arbitrary fashion or in an unfair spirit of partisanship. Its action is to be controlled by juridical norms which are in conformity with the objective moral order. Note here again, there's an appeal to objective morality. So this isn't moral relativism. The council is holding on to the idea of objective morality that governs these sorts of things, including the right to religious liberty. Now, the document also goes on, because sometimes we can think, well, all right, I have the freedom to do this. Well, having freedom doesn't mean there aren't consequences. It doesn't mean that whatever you choose, everything's going to be great, right? If you choose to use your freedom, you have to also be willing to accept the consequences. Gaudium et Spes says there's a certain loss of dignity for a man who cares but little for truth and goodness, or for a conscience which by degrees grows practically sightless as a result of habitual sin. So again, what's it talking about here? If you don't fulfill this obligation of seeking the truth and adhering to it, you become intellectually blind, and you can become morally depraved. And so there's a certain loss of dignity in not seeking the truth and adhering to it. Therefore, religious freedom is not a freedom from the obligation to seek it, but it's a freedom for seeking the truth. Now, there's another thing that comes up with the Dignitatis Humanae, and we can't go into all the complicated details here, but there are some people who tried to make the claim that this document on religious liberty was somehow at odds with prior church teaching about religious liberty. But the council itself says the opposite in the very opening paragraph of Dignitatis Humanae. It says, it searches into the sacred tradition and doctrine of the church, the treasury out of which the church continually brings forth new things that are in harmony with the things that are old. And then right after it specifies that it is referring to immunity from coercion, specifically in civil society, it says, it leaves untouched traditional Catholic doctrine on the moral duty of men and societies toward the true religion and toward the one church of Christ. Over and above all this, the council intends to develop the doctrine of recent popes on the inviolable rights of the human person and the constitutional order of society. So what is this talking about? There were some people that felt that Dignitatis Humanae was somehow saying that it wasn't possible to have a Catholic state, a government that was primarily Catholic and lived according to Catholic values. What this phrase is doing is saying, no, it's leaving the teachings about that untouched, and it's narrowly focusing in on a secular state, on a civil state. Because that's another one of the things that changed between, over the centuries, was that there are very few confessional states anymore, at least Catholic ones. And there's a preponderance of secular states and even atheistic states. And remember, this is during the time where communism had come into play. There were a lot of bishops that wanted to highlight the fact that their governments, under the communism or other atheistic regimes, had no right to suppress their religious liberty. And so this document in many ways was supporting those Catholics who were under persecution, stating that any attempts by those governments to do so is illicit, it's unjust. Those laws are unjust and therefore do not have to be followed. So that's part of the reason. Now, some people wondered then, well, how does this, still link back to the past. And I would recommend you go to the works of Thomas Pink. He's a professor of philosophy at King's College London. He's written a lot on this topic, on Dignitatis Humanae, and its continuity with the prior tradition, especially Leo XIII's encyclical Immortale Dei. Because in there, Leo makes the distinction between the authority of the church over the baptized with regard to divine things and the authority of the state over civil matters. Now, as a matter of historical fact, there were instances in which the state did sort of act as an arm of the church, but in doing so, the state can only act in religious matters if it's acting on behalf of the church over the church's own subjects. So there's a limit to it. But the civil government has no authority of itself to control religious belief and practice. And again, the official relationes bear witness to this at the council. All right. They explicitly state, in other words, that this is meant to be in line with the prior teaching, including Leo XIII. All right. Now we can move on to the next part of our talk here. And we've already discussed that man has a common nature, a common origin, a common end, that there's an obligation for all of us to pursue the truth and to adhere to it. Now we're going to talk about the fact that man has throughout history tried to exercise this freedom and how this has come about in many ways through the various religions. As Nostra Aetate states, men expect from the various religions answers to the unsolved riddles of the human condition, which today, even as in former times, deeply stir the hearts of men. What is man? What is the meaning, the aim of our life? What is moral good? What is sin? Whence suffering, and what purpose does it serve? Which is the road to true happiness? What are death, judgment, and retribution after death? What, finally, is that ultimate inexpressible mystery which encompasses our existence? Whence do we come, and where are we going? In particular, religions that are connected with advanced cultures have struggled to answer these questions. And so Nostra Aetate goes on to talk about some of the most well-known of these religions, and the most populated ones. It talks about Hinduism, for instance, and how it attempts to contemplate divine mystery using an abundance of myths, philosophy, ascetical practices, and meditation. Similarly, Buddhism, in a variety of different forms, recognizes the insufficiency of this changeable world and seeks liberation and illumination. There are other religions that propose ways, teachings, rules of life, and sacred rites to counter the restlessness of the human heart. It's describing practices. So what the council is doing here is it's describing the practices, aims, and beliefs of those religions according to their own understanding. It's not saying, for instance, that Buddhism actually has a way by which you can achieve perfect illumination somehow apart from grace, for instance. It's not saying that. What it's doing is describing these religions' own self-understanding, and to show the fact that they are recognizing certain truths, and they're trying to provide answers to those fundamental questions. Now, it is not then promoting religious indifferentism or saying that they're all the same. Thus, the Council has a twofold approach to this question of the non-Christian religions. First, in charity, it affirms what is good in them, but also insists on the truth of Christianity at the same time. So listen to this quote carefully. The Catholic Church rejects nothing that is true and holy in these religions. She regards with sincere reverence those ways of conduct and of life whose precepts and teachings, which often reflect a ray of that truth which enlightens all men. However, she proclaims and ever must proclaim Christ, the way, the truth, and the life, in whom men may find the fullness of religious life, in whom God has reconciled all things to himself. So while it is recognizing that the various religions have often reflected rays of the truth, it nevertheless at the same time proclaims that Christ himself is the way, the truth, and the life. And therefore, he is actually the answer to all of those fundamental questions that they have been attempting to answer. Now, some people are allergic to saying anything positive about other religions or people of other religions. But in reality, the council is teaching completely orthodox doctrine here. It's recognizing the fact that, the various religions do reflect some truths about the world and have some commendable practices. But it still, in the end, says that Christ is the truth and the fullness of truth. Okay, now the document goes on then to talk about the two monotheistic religions, which are Islam and Judaism, and expresses the fact that we have that in common as the three major monotheistic religions of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. Now again, we don't have time to go into the specifics of this question, but this was another point of contention that we saw in the online Catholic world, was when the Second Vatican Council said that Muslims and Christians worship the same God. And there's been a lot of confusion about this and controversy, and I would point to some other sources for that. But just to give you an idea, there were similar comments about this in prior teachings as well. You see it in St. Robert Bellarmine, who's one of the most well-known Catholic intellectuals and regarded theologians of church history. You see similar statements by Pope St. Gregory VII in a letter to a Muslim ruler during his own day. You see reflections of it in the Catechism of Pius X and in statements by Pius XI and Pius XII. And for those who are interested in Thomism, as I am, Dr. Edward Fazer has a great article explaining this from a Thomistic perspective and shows how you understand whether or not we're worshiping the same God. And he talks about the difference between sense and reference in there. But if you look up Ed Fazer, it's on his own website, so it's accessible for free online. And I recommend you read that and consider it fully. In the end, what this document's doing is calling for cooperation between Christians and non-Christians and to work together towards peace, basically to end all the warring and stuff that goes on based on religion or for other reasons as well. It also explicitly denounces anti-Semitism and likewise reproves as foreign to the mind of Christ any discrimination against men or harassment of them because of their race, color, condition of life, or religion. Now, this is something that's very important. The documents of the Council want to emphasize the dignity of the human person. That's a major part of what it's trying to say. And therefore, it wants to make a distinction between errors or holding erroneous beliefs and the personal dignity that a person has in and of themselves. And so, Gaudium et Spes, for instance, says that the Church calls us to distinguish between error, which always merits repudiation, and the person in error, who never loses the dignity of being a person, even when he is flawed by false or inadequate religious notions. So again, Nostra Aetate and Gaudium et Spes are not saying that all religions are equally true. That would be self-contradictory and therefore could not be true. But what they are saying is that despite our disagreements, people of different religions should love and respect one another and strive for peace. As we'll see, this is not a rejection of missionary work and evangelization, but it is a preamble to it. In fact, Vatican II says that explicitly in Lumen Gentium when it says, "Whatever good or truth is found among them is looked upon by the Church as a preparation for the gospel." In other words, in recognizing the truth and goodness found in other religions, it sees this as opportunities to lead people from those religions to the fullness of truth that is found through Christ. Okay. So basically what the Council is doing is recognizing that individual non-Christians may be seeking the truth sincerely, and it acknowledges that some have actually found rays of that truth and held on to it. and yet it's still proclaiming the fullness of truth in Christ and in Christ alone. Now, the council is also aware that not everyone actually meets this obligation of seeking and adhering to the truth. So it doesn't have rose-colored glasses here. The council acknowledges quite explicitly that quite a few people actually do not seek and adhere to the truth. Some of people even oppose the truth. And so it says in Lumen Gentium, "But often men, deceived by the evil one, have become vain in their reasonings, and have exchanged the truth of God for a lie, serving the creature rather than the Creator." And this raises another point. We mentioned that there's the obligation to seek the truth and to adhere to it. We've said that people have throughout history tried to find answers to fundamental questions, and sometimes they do reflect the truth about those profound questions, including truths about morality, the fact that there must be a creator, for instance. And yet it's always mixed with error. So you have some truth, but an admixture of error with it. And that's why we need divine revelation. So what is the council trying to say here? The various religions are expressions of the fact that we, as humanity, have striven to answer questions about the divine. And we've had some success, but we're very limited in what we can know, especially in our fallen state. And so there's often error mixed in with our own human-made beliefs about the divine and about morality and such. But what we have as a corrective to that is God actually coming down to us to aid us in our human weakness so that we can more easily know the truth about himself and about his will for us. That's divine revelation. That's God coming to us where we are to reveal those truths that we need for our nature to be perfected and for us to be redeemed and to attain our salvation. So, in this context, we can better understand Dignitatis Humanae again, that document on religious liberty. Because before it specifies what religious liberty means, and before it proclaims the obligation to seek the truth, it actually tells us what the truth we must freely seek is. First, the council professes its belief that God himself has made known to mankind the way in which men are to serve him, and thus be saved in Christ and come to blessedness. We believe that this one true religion subsists in the Catholic and Apostolic Church. So even in the document on religious liberty, the council is explicitly stating this truth that you are free to seek and adhere to is the truth found in the Catholic Church and in her teachings that she's received from Christ. So let's finish with a summary of what we've covered so far in these lectures. All of humanity has the same origin and final end, God who calls all to salvation. Due to original and personal sin, we have been separated from God, we have been divided one from another, and we have become disordered within our own selves. We are obligated to seek the truth, especially about God and his will for us, and to adhere to it once it is known. Throughout history, people have striven to seek this truth and expressed their beliefs through various religions, which often do reflect some truth. However, our human frailty means our own attempts to strive at truth are mixed with error, sometimes even grave error. Thus, we need divine help. Divine revelation is necessary. And that's where we will pick up in our next lesson, which will discuss Vatican II's doctrine on divine revelation. God bless.